Let's imagine you were around in the late 16th century in the Kingdom of Hungary. You're not exactly from a family of wealth, so when your parents receive a letter from a grand noblewoman by the name of Elizabeth Bathory, they feel extremely honored. What could such a well-respected and rich woman want from your peasant family, your parents wonder at first, and then on reading the letter they discover that Elizabeth is looking out for the poor and just wants to teach you, their son, some etiquette. Overjoyed by this incredible offer, your parents send you off to the great Chaktisay Castle. What you and your parents don't know is that they've just sent you to a castle we can rightly call one of the most evil places in the world. Number 5. Chaktisay Castle. After hearing what happened there, you might think nothing tops it in the realms of evil, but we can assure you that there have been worse places. Elizabeth Bathory didn't have a very nice childhood, and when she was young, she was around a lot of violence. Another matter that made her life hard was the fact that she had seizures. Back then, no one knew anything about the neurons misfiring in the brain, so epileptic fits were a bit of a mystery. During the days of witch hunts, if a person had a seizure, some holy people might have put it down to the devil being inside them. But Elizabeth, being nobility and all, didn't suffer the terrible burden of experiencing a witch trial. One thing doctors did back then sometimes to try and cure seizures was giving sufferers a dose of a healthy person's blood to drink. And if that happened to Elizabeth as a child, it might account for utterly depraved behavior as an adult. We're not going to recount everything that woman did in her castle, but let's just say that if you've accepted that invite, you wouldn't have been taking any lessons on good manners. You'd have been tortured in the most despicable ways, perhaps burned, frozen, or even covered in honey and live ants. You might have also lost some body parts before your death, and that's why Elizabeth eventually got the nicknames the Blood Countess and Countess Dracula. What happened in the castle stayed in the castle for quite some time, but a lot of people working for the noblewoman knew what was going on. In fact, some of her staff helped her to find the people that would become her victims. Elizabeth was eventually arrested and charged, but unbelievably she wasn't handed a death sentence. Her punishment was that she had to stay confined in her castle, her actual home. You could say she got off lightly considering that she had killed hundreds of young people. The exact figure is not known, but some historians put the number at 650. That alone is mind-blowing. But if you care to research what she actually did to those victims, you will no doubt agree that the castle in her hands became an evil place. The reason we're not going to tell you what happened is it's just too gory and, well, YouTube doesn't like that kind of thing. Number 4. Camp 22. We're now going to talk about the gruesome topic of human experimentation. Here at the Infographics Show, we always like to give you something new. While Japan's horrific wartime human experimentation at its Unit 731 is nothing short of horrific, and all the ghastly things Nazi Dr. Josef Mengele did can bring tears to your eyes, we're going to talk about a place we haven't featured much. Camp 22 was a place in North Korea where someone might have ended up if they'd been accused of the crime of wrong thought. They might also have committed any number of crimes. We only know about the prison camps because defectors who'd spent some time there let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. Conditions in the prison camp were bad enough without human experimentation. One defector said when he was in the camp, around 25% of the prison population died each year from starvation. The place was reportedly closed in 2012, but in the 1990s, something like 50,000 people were sent there. It was always a life sentence, and so no one ever left the camp alive. Former guards and prisoners have said that the guards tortured the prisoners to the extent of inmates missing their eyes or other parts, with some of them looking like living skeletons. The human rights violations that happened there could fill a book, so we'll concentrate on the medical experiments only. One former prisoner named Lee Soon-ok said at one point the camp wanted to test a new poison just to see how effective it was, and the officers at the camp didn't bother with animal trials and went straight to human trials. Lee said this involved 50 women, most of whom were at Camp 22 for merely criticizing the government. They were told to eat some cabbage, and they were also told it contained poison. If they didn't eat it, those women were told their families on the outside would suffer. Lee said soon after the women ate the stuff, they started vomiting, and then all of them died within 20 minutes. Other experiments included using gas chambers, and sometimes the people that entered those chambers were entire families. The outcome was, of course, the death of everyone. A scientist who defected in 2015 said chemical weapons were also tested on the subjects. On other occasions, prisoners would be rounded up and sent for surgery. Surgery they didn't need, of course, and the awful procedures would be done without any kind of anesthesia. What was really scary is that when prisoners were chosen for such experiments, they would first see a van driving around the prison complex. That van would would take them to their certain death. The vehicle was nicknamed the Crow, and it would turn up once or twice a month where the prisoners lived. Number 3. The Raft of Medusa. Here's the story of the Raft of Medusa. In June 1816, a French ship called the Méduse left France for Africa. The short story is that it didn't get there, and that's because it hit a sandbank. There were around 400 people on board, and many of the folks managed to get onto small boats. The people left were in quite a fix, so some of them quickly built a raft. 151 men and women got onto the raft, and the French officers in the boats said they would tow it. They didn't. That's the first evil part of the story. After a few miles, they just cut the raft loose and all those people were left floating in the ocean. Between them, they had a bag of biscuits that they hastily ate on the first day, and they had about 6 casks of wine. They had some fresh water too, but much of that was lost overboard when the men fought over it. As you can probably tell already, things then went from bad to worse. With no food and no water, what happened next was a survival of the fittest. On the first night alone, some 20 people were dead from either fighting or being washed overboard. Some accounts say that some people were just thrown overboard. By day 4, of the 152 people, only 67 of them were left. Many had died in fights, some had died from dehydration, and some had taken their own lives. Seeing what was going on, they just threw themselves off the raft. This is how one survivor later explained the scene. 2 young sailors and 1 baker were not afraid to jump into the sea, thereby bringing their lives to an end. This was after bidding farewell to their friends. By day 8, some of those that were weak or wounded were killed, but since the fittest of the bunch were literally starving, they ate their victims. This is how that survivor described one of those nights. The unfortunates who had been spared by death during that terrible night fell upon the bodies that covered the raft, cut them into pieces, or devoured them as they were. He said some of the men refused to eat the dead at first and instead feasted on fabric from clothes and hats. But when they saw just how much better the men who had eaten the dead looked, they joined in, if not somewhat less inhibited by the wine they'd drunk. It was by sheer luck on the 13th day that a ship called the Argus saw the raft floating in the ocean. We say by luck because the French authorities hadn't even sent out a search party. Let's remember that those who were left on the raft at the start were deemed less important people, and that's why the story is even more horrific. As one historian once wrote, it actually exposed things as they were. You save the elite, and too bad if there are no more room for the others. That's not to say that there weren't many good people on the raft. Some ate their dead friends, some men were buried at sea, and it was only out of sheer desperation that they turned to cannibalism. On the other hand, when they saw that some of the men were pretty much half dead, rather than share meat or wine with them or eat them, they just threw them overboard. For years after, a lot of people criticized the men not for eating the dead, but for throwing the dying into the sea. When they were finally rescued, there were 15 men still alive, although 5 of them would die shortly after being picked up by the Argus. What the men had been through has become one of the most talked about horrors in the history of mankind. We'll give you a happy-ish ending, though. This is how one of the survivors described the feeling on the raft when the men saw the approaching rescue ship. We embraced one another and rejoiced in a manner bordering on insanity. Tears of happiness rolled down our dried-up cheeks. You can call this event a tragedy more than an evil, but sometimes human desperation can be an evil in itself. Number 2. The papacy under Pope John Paul XII. Okay, so there have been more evil places and people, but if you were a religious person, then you might argue that the evilest you could get would be if you were a degenerate religious leader. There have been quite a few bad popes, but perhaps the worst of them all was the man that headed the Christian church from 955 until his death in 964. It's not a question of what Pope John Paul XII did, but what he didn't do. He didn't do any good things, that's for sure, and he committed a long list of crimes. This leader of the church, it's said, shocked even the worst offenders of immorality in Rome, a man whose total depravity seemed to know no end. He surrounded himself with women and turned his holy house into a kind of house of ill repute. He took many lovers, some not exactly willing to go with him, and fornicated with him at the holy sites and also in the papal palace. That pope has been accused of defiling the tombs of saints, of borrowing money from pilgrims to finance his bad gambling habit, and has even been accused of blinding someone he didn't like. On one occasion, it said he tortured and murdered a cardinal. If that's not bad enough, this man, who should have been a devout Christian, was said to have tried to call upon demons. One historian wrote that he had toasted to the devil with wine. If you're religious, you can't really get more evil than that. Another historian wrote that John XII was a robber, a murderer, and incestuous person unworthy to represent Christ upon the pontifical throne. This abominable priest soiled the chair of St. Peter for 9 entire years and deserved to be called the most wicked of popes. We should note that some people that wrote bad things about this man might have had a reason to dislike him or even dislike Catholicism, but Catholics themselves have criticized this man, and so have many other historians. Number 1. Wherever witch hunts took place. There were many witch hunts around Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, and many innocent women were tortured and executed. Those witch hunts, supposedly in the name of goodness, are up there with the most shameful things humans have ever done to each other. There were a lot of witch hunters, but we'll look at a person named Matthew Hopkins. He came from East Anglia in England, and he had the title of Witchfinder General. We certainly don't want to upset our viewers from East Anglia, and we're not saying your wonderful part of England is evil, but back in the day some pretty awful things went down there. As many as 300 alleged witches were executed in East Anglia and close by after being investigated by Hopkins from 1644 to 1646. How did he know they were witches, you might ask? Well, sometimes the women might have been accused of being abnormal by someone who just didn't like them. It was as simple as that at times, but often they might have had a mental illness or a neurological condition that wasn't understood at the time. As we already said, seizures to some crazy folks were the work of the devil. There was a famous book called Malleus Maleficarum, which translates from Latin as the Hammer of the Witches. And after the printing press was invented, it sold a lot of copies and had 30 editions printed all over the course of a century. Hopkins no doubt had his own copy of this book. His investigations would often include hurting the women and trying to make them confess. Sometimes he deprived them of sleep until they confessed. Other times he tied them to a chair and threw them into a river. If they floated, that meant they were witches, since if they'd been baptized, they would have sunk. And the problem then, of course, was that trying to pull the innocent women out of the water before they drowned. Then he had the devil's spot test, which meant pricking the woman with a pointed object at various points of her body. Of course, that hurt, but if one point on the body seemed less painful to the woman, that meant the devil had entered her body at that point. If the woman bled and an animal licked that blood, her witchiness was, to the interrogator, a certainty. There was also the tear test. This involved telling the accused the story of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. If she didn't break down in tears, she was in league with the devil. Again, we should tell you that some women who were accused of being witches were mentally ill or suffered from mental retardation. That story might not have meant much to those women. Human evil has perhaps never been so personified than in the face of Matthew Hopkins and others like him. They spread like a plague all over Europe, North America, and the rest of the world. And we at the Infographics Show are gonna say they were absolutely evil, if indeed evil exists. Sources don't always agree on how many women were persecuted, but it could have been as many as 1 million. We must apologize to you for revealing those depressing facts, but we'll leave you with some words of the Spanish writer and philosopher George Santayana. Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. If we can think of any 2 shows that you need to watch after this, these are the ones. What is Hell Really Like? And The Origin of Evil, the Devil. Click one now and don't wait.